This week on The Sceptic, I speak to Tom Jones, writer and Conservative councillor, on Ukraine, the bust-up in the Oval Office and the parlous state of Europe's armed forces.
Well, what armed forces? We have maybe 25 tanks that we can put into the field. We will be lucky if we can put a brigade into active service, and it will be a miracle if we can sustain them in the field for any length of time. And we are probably the most capable military in Europe.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
Michael Wolff, author of several insider accounts about Team Trump on what really makes the Donald tick.
I mean, there's little that's deliberate about Donald Trump. I mean, it really exists in the moment. There's a whole pathology here. You cannot talk to Donald Trump like you would normally talk to another person. Donald Trump does not share the stage.
Drill, baby, drill.
And for our premium subscribers, I speak to the Daily Sceptic's new energy editor, Dr. Tilak Doshi, on how the whole net zero house of cards is coming crashing down.
For the first time, we've got the administration itself suggesting that skeptics who question this demonization of CO2, a lot of these debates now are coming out onto the mainstream because no more is a social media under the stranglehold of censorship.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month to the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. Hello and welcome to episode 30 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Now, can Donald Trump bring peace to Ukraine? Just what went so disastrously wrong in the bust-up in the Oval Office?
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now.
And just what is the point of all this war posturing in Europe if we haven't got the forces to back it up? Well, to discuss all that and more today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Tom Jones, who's a Conservative councillor and a writer for publications including the Critic and UnHerd. Welcome to The Sceptic, Tom.
Thanks for having me, Laurie.
Yeah, good to have you here. Okay, so there's lots of things to get into in this fraught geopolitical situation that we're going through. But of course, the key event that's happened in the past week was this bust-up in the Oval Office between President Zelensky and President Trump and Vice President Vance. And there's some different perspectives on that and why that happened. So on the one hand, it's been maintained that this was really an ambush by Trump and Vance, that they kind of had never really had an intention of getting that mineral deal signed, which was on the table, and that he had essentially been summoned there to be humiliated by the MAGA administration. And then on the other hand, some people have noted that Zelensky's conduct in that interview, which was of course live and being beamed out to the whole world, was not that professional necessarily. And in particular, there's this moment where he turns to Vance and actually asks him a question directly, and which was effectively criticising both his knowledge of the conflict and of the administration's own strategy of diplomacy, that was really the point at which the whole thing started to kick off. So between those, I mean, which explanation do you favour, I suppose, and why do you think it all went so wrong?
To be honest, I think the meeting went wrong from the moment they decided to televise it. So originally, the meeting was for the minerals deal, which is actually a great piece of strategy that I think was Zelensky's idea. Basically, the idea to give America a concrete financial incentive to continue defending Ukraine. It's a great piece of diplomacy. But I think the moment where it went wrong was when they decided to do the public Q&A, which was, from what I understand, was a Trump decision. It's a very Trumpian thing to do, to take unvetted questions at a conference of this scale and of this importance. Because fundamentally, I think the two sides went to that meeting with different ideas. I think that Zelensky went in there wanting to show cooperation, whilst Trump was there to basically assert control over the peace process. So Zelensky wanted to kind of reassure Ukrainians that the American support is still on the table, to signal strength to Russia, continued strength to Russia probably as well, and as well obviously secure that deeper US investment. Whereas what Trump, I think, was trying to do was he wanted to show that Russia that basically he is alone in dictating Ukraine's stance in ceasefire talks. And I think that clash between those two objectives basically caused throughout the conference. You can tell that there's some underlying friction. And I think as Zelensky refused to fall in line with Trump on TV, I think that's what's fundamentally caused the clash. I think Zelensky probably assumed he could pressure Trump into providing stronger support via kind of that public Q&A, which is something he's done before. I remember reading something about even Biden at one point putting the phone down on him because he was pressuring him so much, talking about the aid he wasn't getting rather than the aid he was getting. And I think from Trump's perspective, I think Trump sees the war as unwinnable, and I think he resents Zelensky for not agreeing with him on that. So I think basically that this is just a clash of objectives, and the moment it went wrong was when they decided to make it public.
And of course, when the bust-up occurred, they were actually only one question from the end. Trump had said it would be the last question. And so do you really think there was no world in which this could have just gone a bit more smoothly and they could have finished up and headed into the back room to maybe get something signed?
I think it's possible, yes. But I think perhaps everybody in that room has been badly advised when they decided to make it public. I think one of the reasons that it went so viral was just that it's such an unusual moment to see, negotiations of this size debated in public. Normally all of this is done behind the doors. And I was reading a piece by Chris Bayliss earlier today, who made the point that Zelensky might have become the victim of his own success. He's been very, 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 very good at working with other leaders, Boris Johnson, into basically embarrassing the Americans and pressuring the Americans into providing the level of support that Ukraine needs, even if it did so grudgingly. And I think that strategy has worked very well up until the point where Trump too takes power.
And so we'll talk about Europe in a second then and its response to this. But in terms of Zelensky's relationship with the US and the president, obviously there's been a tremendous fallout here. Do you think that means that he's a busted flush as far as his relationship with America goes? And I mean, does that mean he's going to have to go?
It's questionable, to be honest. Ultimately, how I think this will play out is that Trump will get his way. And I think that because I am an IR realist. I think that might makes right. When Stalin, I think it was at Yalta, when he asked Churchill how many divisions has the Pope got, that's such an interesting little historical example, because it points out that no matter how morally right one side is, ultimately you can be as morally right as you want, but you have to be able to enforce that moral right. And whether Zelensky has to go, I think probably yes, if I'm being honest. I don't see a position. I don't see a way for his position to be recoverable. Certainly not long term. Whether he goes before a peace deal, probably not, but probably immediately after, yes.
And as you say, there's the importance of being able to enforce what you think is right. And so obviously this has implications for this security summit that happened over the weekend, hosted by Keir Starmer with European leaders. And I know you've been writing about the state of our armed forces here and in Europe recently. I mean, they're not really in any position, are they, to stand up to Russia?
Well, what armed forces? I think I read a piece in the Independent earlier today that said we have maybe 25 tanks that we can put into the field. We will be lucky, and this is just Britain, we will be lucky if we can put a brigade into active service, and it will be a miracle if we can sustain them in the field for any length of time. And frankly, we are probably the most capable, apart from the French, maybe, we are probably the most capable military in Europe. We've just spent lots and lots, obviously announced more defence spending, but 6 months ago, Labour cut 500 million from the defence budget, I think. They cut 160 million quid from the Tempest fighter program for the next gen Tempest fighter. They scrapped ships, drones, helicopters. We no longer have any amphibious capability. Providing so much more funding for the military to fill the hole of cuts we made just 6 months ago is a really great example of the plane, ship, and tank crash that Britain's military has become. But I think in some ways, actually, this might be good for Europe. I think that in some ways, Trump 1 was probably the foreign policy that Europe needed, and Trump 2 is the foreign policy that Europe needs. That it deserves, because Trump 1 was basically predicated on the idea that he was actually going to do something rather than complain about getting Europe to spend more on its defence, which Europe absolutely refused to do. They ramped up spending a little bit, but nowhere near enough, and still relied on the American military to provide the final backstop of security in Europe. Trump 2 has made it clear that is no longer the case. And now, instead of having a long-term build-up of our militaries, we are basically having to scramble. European nations are having to scramble to suddenly massively increase defence spending. But I think that will be good for Europe. I think that will be good for Europe because it will speed up a European independence on defence. I think it might also speed up cooperation, which I think really is going to unlock the future of European security. For instance, we and the French have aircraft carriers. The Dutch have a really excellent blue water conventional subservice. Poland is investing very heavily in tanks. So getting those European nations to work more closely together, I think, will actually be a fantastic thing. Historically, I think because of the Cold War, we've looked at European militaries as a kind of limes Germanicus against the Russians. It's our job to hold the Russians at the Fulda Gap until the Yanks arrive. But if the Yanks are no longer arriving, then we've got to rethink what we do with defence. And I think it might also force us away from the arbitrary 2% target of NATO, which I think would be good, and force us to look at funding specific capabilities instead.
Right, so that's all long term, of course, but in terms of, at the moment, Starmer has said things like, we're going to put boots on the ground and planes in the air. I mean, this is high rhetoric, but, without the Americans, this is not really feasible, is it?
No, it's just not feasible. We don't have, certainly not if any kind of conflict were to break out at all, because, as I say, we can maybe put a brigade in the field. That is not going to last very long if something broke off. We probably can't provide them with enough ammunition, and we certainly can't support our forces, European forces, and the Ukrainians. Again, we are one of the best, most capable militaries in Europe, and it's just not feasible that European defence will step up within, I would say, at least 10 years, because building up your defence capability, it's not just spending more money on defence. Like, here's a big contract to Rheinmetall. You have to build up the supply chains of defence. You have to build up the technical skills. You have to build the machine tools in order to build the new tanks and bits of equipment that you need. And all of this takes years and years and years and years. It cannot be done in months. It cannot be done in months. And we should have done it years ago. We should have done it. We should have listened to Trump 1's warning. And had we done that, we probably would have been in a position where actually we can sustain more than a brigade in the field for quite a long time. But we didn't, so we ain't.
So my question on that in particular is there going to be a realization that these summits and these grand meetings and these shows of strength are really just performative? I mean, is the penny going to drop at some point?
I'm honestly not sure. Because I think if we really wanted to focus on security, Starmer would be meeting a lot less with other European leaders and a lot more with, say, the CEO of BAE Systems, because actually that is where the power is going to come from. It's from building up our defence infrastructure. We have promised so often that we need to stop hollowing out Britain's defence capability. And I just don't have any inkling that this time is going to be different to any others. There will be speeches, there will be strategy, there will probably be some kind of defence review, and then that will kind of be it. There will be more money. Nobody will investigate if it's being well spent. Nobody will investigate if it's actually going to uplift any of our military capability. And things will just roll on as they have for probably since before the Falklands.
And so in terms of what this means for a potential settlement of the war then, so this week US aid to Ukraine has been revoked. And what's that going to mean for how this develops in the coming months?
Well, I come back to my point I made earlier. Ultimately, I think Trump will get his way because America is the only real force that is sustaining Ukraine. We can't do it. Europeans put together can't really do it, not to the level of support that Ukraine needs to hold the line, certainly not to mount any counteroffensive if they could, which is questionable. So I think ultimately...
So he's forcing Ukraine to the negotiating table by withdrawing aid?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's completely what he's doing. He is signaled to Putin that he is in charge, that he is not going to be dominated by Zelensky in, I think, the way that his domestic voters saw Zelensky dominating Biden and extracting huge funds and sums for what they saw as very little return. And yeah, basically, I think that all of Trump's positioning around Ukraine has been a way to basically denigrate Zelensky and Zelensky's support from the US to make clear it is no longer unconditional, and that peace, whether he likes it or not, is coming.
Okay, and so let's talk about the British politics element of this then. So one of the quite disturbing things about this is that anyone who's questioning whether or not it would be advisable to put our less than a brigade onto the ground in Ukraine is being painted as unpatriotic in some way. And so to give an example, this week Nigel Farage raised that particular question in the Commons, and he was dismissed by Starmer as fawning over Putin. And what do you make of this attempt to portray anyone who doesn't agree that Europe should be maximally interventionist as unpatriotic or, aligned with Putin?
Well, I think there are two strands to this. So first of all, I think that there is an anti-reform particular anti-reform strand to this that I think is very clearly, because Reform Anew is very clearly a new development. I think it's interesting. Farage has clearly not done what most would have expected him to, which is to go 100% behind Trump. He has very clearly been on the side of Zelensky, no matter what Keir Starmer says, really. They are. I think that probably shows an increasing level of professionalism and reform. They've clearly looked at polling and gone, right, okay, this is an incredibly unpopular decision to take. We are going to do the domestically popular thing rather than protect Farage's personal relationship with Trump, which I think is probably a sign that they're maturing as a party, and also probably that they've got a bit more money to be able to do polling on that. But I think Reform have been very interesting in how they've approached this, which is that they are doing the practicalities of, they are questioning the practicalities of deployment, which is what they've been criticised for. So as well as Starmer criticising Farage on Twitter, one Labour MP argued Rupert Lowe asking for details of the plan for deployment was basically so that Russia could find out the details of the deployment, which is a bit like saying that the reason why Britain went wrong in Iraq and Afghanistan was it had too many MPs asking too many questions about what our soldiers were doing there. Both of those wars turned into quagmires because of a lack of capability, because of insufficient planning and totally undefined strategic aims. And I think it's interesting that Reform seem to have learned those lessons and are prepared to put those questions across and ask those questions in a way that Tories aren't and didn't, particularly over Iraq, where only two of them, I think, voted against the war in Iraq because Ian Duncan Smith was so firmly behind it. So I think it shows a growing maturity in Reform, and I think it really does mark them out as a party that are not just another form of Conservatives. And then obviously there's another element to all of this, which is the kind of tone of the centrist dad commentators who have been kind of advocating for, I think you said, maximal European level deployment. I'm going to be slightly cheeky now. Given the age of the average person, of the average kind of centrist dad commentator, I wonder if it's biological, and I wonder if it's testosterone related. I wonder if it's a reaction against slightly declining testosterone levels, a bit like buying a Porsche, maybe. But I think, to make a serious point, I think most of us have never had to think seriously about geostrategy. Because since the Americans shafted us during Suez, it's been clear that our interests can no longer be pursued independently, or at least without kind of prior American approval. And because we have outsourced the responsibility of international affairs, I think we've basically released our grasp on the realities. So, because we have no real strategic responsibility, we have no serious thought in the worlds of international relations outside of a very, very, very small clique at, maybe Russia, somewhere like that. So basically, I think, we are now favouring kind of pointless virtue signalling, performative causes over actually the hard realities of power, because we don't have to think about the hard realities of power. And that's why we get an instantaneous kind of often very emotional impulsive reaction about these issues. I think there are very few people in the mainstream capable, willing, or interested in engaging in kind of any kind of dispassionate discussion about international affairs.
As you mentioned the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War as comparisons there, and I think that's actually quite appropriate. But of course, the one that we often hear is that this is like the 1930s, and that the Second World War again, and Putin is basically like Hitler, and therefore, if you're doing something that's remotely pro-Putin in any way, then you're essentially appeasing Hitler, and this is the worst thing you could possibly do. And therefore, well, the way that this ends up being talked about is we can't really think about it carefully because it's become so moralized. I mean, we need new historical analogies, don't we?
Yes, but the moralization is the point, right? That's why we keep coming back to that. So I always remember I wrote about this a long time ago for the New Statesman about why Britain could never seem to escape Second World War analogies. And basically, I think that the war is the furnace in which the identity of modern Britain has been forged, right? And I always remember this quote by A.N. Wilson, which is that there was a genuine glory and a dignity to the story of the old hero returning to slay some dragons before, bloodied and weakened, he and his Victorian world sank into the regions of the twilight. And basically, I think we are constantly bathing in the afterglow of one of history's most noble acts, which was Britain completely sacrificing itself and its place in the world in order to defeat Nazism. And I think the other thing about it is that Nazism was such a unique moral evil that basically it has become the defining moral event of the modern age. It creates a black and white sense of good and evil that plays perfectly to the all or nothing nature of contemporary politics. And the other thing is, everybody knows the story of the war. I've seen somebody say that this is more comparable to 1740s Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but the moment you start explaining it, it becomes diminished and people tune out because they don't just have that instant grasp of the history that they do during the Second World War. It's the Nazis the Second World War is a fixed point on everybody's moral compass. And that's why we keep coming back to it. And it is a complete disaster for any kind of serious thought about international relations.
Okay, Tom Jones, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thanks very much.
With so much at stake in global geopolitics right now, the disposition of America's mercurial commander-in-chief has never been more important. So it's as good a time as any to wonder just what it is that makes Donald Trump tick. And to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Michael Wolff, who is a journalist and the author of several books on Trump, including Fire and Fury, first of all in 2018, then Siege, then Landslide, and most recently, All or Nothing. And that's out now from all good bookshops. Welcome to The Sceptic, Michael.
Nice to be here.
And so before we get into some of the many interesting questions about Trump himself, I just want to focus on you here for a second, because you've been the sort of unofficial court biographer of Trump for a while. And that's an interesting and almost unexpected role, given that a lot of your books are often received as quite critical of him. So I suppose my question is, why do you continue to be able to have such insider access to Team Trump?
Good question, and I'm not exactly sure I know the answer because it isn't straightforward. But I would say that this is first of all, I've been doing this for a very long time, and I've been speaking to these people now on a steady basis for on the verge of 10 years, which is somewhat appalling to me. But in that time, you get to know people pretty well. And even though I might be critical of the Trump administration, you just become friends with people after so long, and you get to know and get to understand that they too, everyone around Donald Trump, is aware of the phenomenon of Donald Trump, that that to be in proximity to him is to have deeply, deeply, deeply mixed feelings about him. And so I think I've become an outlet of those feelings. And in a way, they don't necessarily see my books as critical, or if they see them as critical, they also see them as a pretty accurate reflection of the phenomenon, let's call it.
Okay, and as for yourself, would you see yourself as a critic or an observer?
I'm a writer. I'm just the guy there who has a view on the story and is able to tell it.
And of course, your latest book, as all of them have, has been heavily criticized by Trump. I think so. You call this one a fake job. What do you make of that criticism?
Well, I suppose in some sense it would be disappointing not to get it. It's in its own way. It's an affirmation.
It's attention, I suppose. And so, right, let's get into the key event of the past week, and that's obviously the bust-up in the Oval Office. And I suppose just in the lead-up to that, there was this provocative post that Trump had made, as he often does, on Truth Social, in which he called Zelensky a dictator. And then, of course, the day before this, the meeting with Zelensky, he had, speaking to Keir Starmer, he'd actually walked that comment back and said, sort of, did I say that? And so,
well, let me. I think it's probably a good idea to set some context for what Trump says, shit Trump says, and in having been the target of some of the things that he has said on social media over the years, I sort of have. I mean, I have somewhat of a feeling for. Whether this is real or posturing or just the spontaneity of the moment. And I would add to that I mean, following throughout the campaign, following his posts and Truth Social, which not many people did, and another point of context, he's on this social media platform, Truth Social, which he owns, and really it's a social media platform of one. I mean, there is nobody on Truth Social but effectively Donald Trump. And if you followed it, which not many people have over the course of the campaign, because as I say, there's no one on this, it kind of is... I don't know quite how to describe it. I mean, if you followed his posts on a daily basis, you might reasonably say the man has come unhinged, unglued. I mean, on many occasions over the campaign, there would be 100 posts a night, railing, flailing, off the deep end stuff. So I think you always have to keep that in mind when you quote Donald Trump and take seriously or take meaningfully the kinds of things that he has said.
And is he, if not directly typing, is he authoring all of these himself?
Not necessarily, but I mean, he has a kind of this retinue of yes people and people who are just attuned to his every kind of moment in which his rage or his dislikes and dissatisfactions, so they kind of channel this. But he also, at the same time, it may well be him in person.
And so obviously this was part of the background noise leading up to the Oval Office meeting. And so there's a lot to get into about it. But one of the ways it's been portrayed is as an ambush, and as if they were basically deliberately engineering this kind of bust up. Is that the way you read it?
There's little that's deliberate about Donald Trump. I mean, it really exists in the moment. And this may be, I think, if you took the long view, this may be what he wanted. Even that, he doesn't necessarily want anything. It's the moment. And I saw what happened in that moment. Zelensky tried to make a case, or tried to explain, or tried to have a conversation even. These are the kinds of things that you cannot do with Donald Trump. You cannot do. You cannot approach him with, I have information to impart to you. I have an opinion I want you to hear. I have a disagreement with the opinion you might have. You cannot, and absolutely, I can't exaggerate this enough. He will shut down when you do that. Or he will react in a, if he could slap you, he would. And I'm not sure what the exact operation, and I've thought about this a lot, and an inability to be challenged, an inability to absorb other information, so he has to then push back against receiving it. But there's a whole pathology here. You cannot talk to Donald Trump like you would normally talk to another person. It cannot happen. And Zelensky tried to do that.
Although one of the points people have made is that in talking to him, or rather talking to Vance, is what he did, and he directly asked Vance a question, and as opposed to addressing the media. Would you say that was violating a norm of these kinds of press conferences in trying to have a substantive discussion as opposed to just batting away questions from the media?
I don't know. I mean, even so, I mean, Zelensky, I mean, he obviously had he's obviously at a disadvantage, obviously nervous. I mean, in a traditional diplomatic setting, everybody deals with these departures in a diplomatic fashion. The Vance role there, I mean, the Vance role is, Vance's entire survival is based on his willingness to display an abject, sycophantic loyalty to Donald Trump. Vance is the designated flunky. As Mike Pence was before, I think Vance absolutely understands this and made a decision when he took this job and went into this White House. This is what I have to do to survive. So at that moment, it was, I'm going to say what I know Donald Trump will want to hear, and which will endear me to Donald Trump. So not about Zelensky, but about Donald Trump.
Yeah, let's definitely come back onto Vance and his prospects as vice president in a second. But sticking with Zelensky, though, the key question is, well, can he find his way back into Trump's good books?
Well, I think that there's two questions. Does he want to find his way back into Trump's good books? And the other question is, can he? And you can always find your way back into Donald Trump's good books by just heaping flattery on him. That's the only operation. That's the only intake of information he can tolerate, and then he's glad to tolerate that. But does Zelensky want? This is the fundamental question for Zelensky and for the rest of the world and for European leaders, clearly, is does Donald Trump want Vladimir Putin to win? And it would appear that is reasonable. That appears to be exactly what he wants. So I'm not sure where that leaves Zelensky and Ukraine. We're on a knife's edge here that the U.S. becomes the enemy of Ukraine.
So I think you're saying that if Zelensky does eat an enormous amount of humble pie and plays his cards right, to mix my metaphors, that he could actually find his way back into Trump's good graces.
Well, I'm not sure what the good graces, what the nature of those good graces are, or what they get him. You can, you can, just merely by flattering Donald Trump, you can be someone who he will flatter in return. What does that get you? If you're Zelensky, I'm not sure. Donald Trump very clearly wants to give the advantage to Russia and Vladimir Putin at this point.
Right. And so what do you make about the suggestion or the attempt to get a mineral deal, and the idea being that in having Trump's ego invested in peace in this way, and obviously some of America's interests as well, that would be the best way of ensuring American cooperation?
I can sell you the Brooklyn Bridge too.
All right, so let's turn to Vance then. So you said that he was essentially playing the role of flunky. How do you rate his prospects of being the nominee in 3 years?
100% of the people who have been around Donald Trump certainly in the last White House, their fate has been humiliation, to be publicly fired, to be indicted. No one gets out alive. The chances for J.D. Vance to get out alive, non-existent. Donald Trump does not share the stage.
So you foresee it souring then, their currently quite chummy relationship?
Yeah, you remember the Mike Pence relationship? I mean, no one could have been a better shadow, a bigger loyalist. I mean, he just did whatever Donald Trump wanted him to do. And that did not end well.
Right. But so is there nevertheless a difference between the White House this time around and last time around with the selection of the top team? I think the likes of Rubio, Hegseth and others.
No. The thing about Donald Trump is that he doesn't change. Donald Trump in the first administration, the first White House, was the same as Donald Trump in Trump Tower. Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago was the same guy he was in the White House. Again, in the White House, he will be what Donald Trump has always been. He's a simple machine. He does what he has always done in the past. I would say, he's probably incapable of learning, certainly uninterested in learning.
Right. Although, of course, one of the key things people say he's learned from 2016 is that he wasn't really expecting to win that time, and he didn't really have a proper team ready. Whereas this time, there's been this flurry of activity in the first few months. Would you say he's been more prepared for the White House this time around?
No. Well, I would push back that there's anything much different about what's happened in the first couple of months. I mean, he went into the White House with a flurry of, the Muslim bans and, ripping children from their mother's arms at the borders. I mean, headline after headline of things we had never seen before, and we're just going through a similar repeat of that. I mean, Donald Trump works on headlines. If he doesn't have the headline, he doesn't exist, literally in his own mind. So that's what's going on now. I mean, the Musk thing is, essentially Steve Bannon played the Musk role in the first White House. They're both on the cover of Time magazine, both the would-be co-presidents or whatever that is, both with the role of disruptor in chief. And Steve lasted for 6 months, and I think that's probably a reasonable measure for Elon Musk. So again, I from my point of view, there isn't much that's different. We've seen this movie before.
So the love-in with Musk won't last, you think? What do you think started it off? What does Trump see in Musk?
I think he's useful like Steve was. He's useful to Trump. He's the guy out there getting the bad headlines. He's Mr. Evil. But I also think that there's this other funny thing that's happened because the media is saying, when are they going to break up? Because we've seen this show before. And that actually protects Musk, because Trump can't be seen to do what the media says he's going to do. So that gives Musk a little more run room than he might otherwise have had.
And so in terms of the book then, so you followed the campaign quite closely. And of course, the most dramatic event in that was the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania at that rally. What are some insider details about that people might not know?
Well, I mean, I think it's been fairly covered. It's kind of an extraordinary moment, not least of all because it really goes to the heart of this strange Trump luck to have someone attempt to assassinate you and then to shoot you in the one place on the body which it would be most safe to be shot, in the ear. Who does that happen to? Extraordinary.
And did it have a profound effect on him?
Well, again, I mean, here is something that would have had a profound effect on anyone. And I think it did have an effect on him, but I'm not sure how much Trump is affected by things, which is another point to his character. How much does external reality affect Donald Trump? I mean, he was indicted 4 times. An indictment of an American politician ends their career. A criminal indictment ends it 100% of the time, ends it over. And he was indicted 4 times with the overwhelming likelihood that he would be convicted and spend likely the rest of his life in jail. Now, anyone else would have faltered in the face of that, to say the least. And how did that? I mean, that certainly registered on him, unlike the way it would register on anyone else. It was as though he just didn't quite get the full implications of this, and therefore, by not getting the full implications, he was able to in fact escape those implications.
And as for Britain then, a key part of Anglo-American relations, or certainly that we're making a key part of it, is Trump's sentimentality towards the royal family. Do you have a sense of why he feels so strongly about that?
Yeah, I think that's it's a childish thing on his part. I mean, he doesn't care about the UK, and he's like a child with the king and the queen and royalty, and like he's seen a postcard.
Right, but was it therefore a wise negotiating move to offer him a second state visit?
I'm not sure what the UK gets out of that. I'm not sure what Starmer gets out of this. I mean, other than a moment in which they could both flatter each other. I think it's a series of utterly empty gestures.
And so another key question for British politics is Nigel Farage and the extent of his influence on Trump. How close is that relationship?
Zero, absolutely zero. Farage somewhat plays the courtier role, as many people do, to the extent that Trump is interested in him. I think he's not interested in him at all. He's, barely notices him.
Right, okay. And so finally for you then, what's next for you? Are you going to be sticking around in the White House for the rest of the term? Are you going to be writing another book?
Well, my dream is always not to write another book about Donald Trump.
And will you achieve it? You don't know.
No. Here. I always think that I might, but I have yet to date.
Okay, well, Michael Wolff, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thanks.
Well, we've heard a lot about Donald Trump on this episode and the effect his administration is having on geopolitics. But Trump 2.0 is also upending net zero, both in America and across the world too. And to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Tilak Doshi, who is an economist, a former contributor to Forbes, and he's now the Daily Sceptic's energy editor. Welcome to The Sceptic, Tilak.
Thank you, Laurie. look forward to it.
Good to have you here, and welcome on board. And so before we get into Trump and the energy transition and everything, let's talk about why we've got you here. So you used to work at Forbes, and now you don't. And that's because you penned an article which was, well, dissenting against a consensus that they didn't want dissented against. I mean, tell us what happened.
The basic theme of my article regarding the appointment of J.D. Vance by Mr. Trump when he was campaigning for the elections was the argument that J.D. Vance was an excellent choice and that he knew more about energy than many of his critics gave him credit for.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.